It started with a cup of coffee. Actually, scratch that. It started with her need for attention. I'd built my empire from scratch, going from a broke college dropout to a self-made millionaire. You know, one of those. Hustle until your idols become your rivals. Stories. My wife, Vanessa, had been there from the beginning. But somewhere along the way, I think she forgot what the grind looked like. You're always working, Mason, she'd complain, arms crossed and voice sharp. Do you even remember the last time we had dinner together? Just the two of us? I'd usually brush her off, thinking she'd understand. After all, I wasn't just working for me, I was building this life for us. Big house, fancy cars, luxury vacations. I thought that's what happiness looked like. Turns out, she had a different version in mind. So, on a Sunday afternoon, when I thought she was running errands, Vanessa was at Joe's Brew and Roast, a quaint little coffee shop a few blocks away. She'd started going there a couple of months ago. Sundays became her day, as she liked to put it. At first, I thought she just needed some time to herself. Honestly, I didn't ask too many questions. Big mistake. It was a quiet Sunday when I first noticed something off. Vanessa had just walked out the door, clutching her oversized tote bag, wearing the kind of smile I hadn't seen in months. I'll be back later, she called casually over her shoulder. Where you headed? I asked, barely glancing up from my laptop. Just running errands, she replied, the answer coming too fast, like she'd rehearsed it. I didn't think much of it at the time. I had a board meeting coming up on Monday and a stack of financial reports to wade through. But something about the way she left stuck with me. The way she lingered in front of the mirror before heading out, the faint scent of a perfume I didn't recognize. Vanessa never wore anything too floral, yet there it was. By the time I looked up from my work, hours had passed. Vanessa still wasn't home. Probably out shopping, I told myself. But I felt this strange knot of unease. Call it intuition, or maybe guilt for how little attention I'd been paying to her lately. Either way, it left me restless. The next weekend, I decided to ask her about it. You've been spending a lot of Sundays out, I said, trying to keep my tone light. What's the big draw? You find a secret yoga class or something? Vanessa was flipping through a magazine, her legs tucked under her on the couch. She didn't even look up. I like the coffee shop near the park. It's nice to get out of the house for a bit. Joe's Brew and Roast? Yeah, that's the one, she replied quickly, maybe too quickly. Why? You thinking of joining me? Her tone was playful, but there was an edge to it. A challenge. Like she didn't actually want me to say yes. Nah, I shrugged, forcing a laugh. I'm more of a grab-it-and-go guy. She smiled at that, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. The following Sunday, I noticed she was getting dressed like she was going to a party, not a coffee shop. Tight jeans, a fitted blouse, and just the right amount of makeup to look effortlessly stunning. For errands? Looking sharp, I said as she walked past me. Thanks, she replied with a little smirk. Don't wait up for lunch, okay? I'll grab something while I'm out. She left before I could say anything else. That knot of unease was back. Later that afternoon, I found myself staring at her side of the closet. Her perfume, the one she wore every Sunday, was there, nearly empty. It was expensive, something I'd bought her a year ago on a business trip to Paris. She'd barely touched it before, saying it was too strong. So why was she suddenly wearing it now? Something wasn't adding up. I went to her vanity and rifled through her makeup drawer. A lipstick caught my eye, bright red. Bold. Not something she typically wore. When I twisted it open, the tip was worn down, like it had seen a lot of use recently. I knew I shouldn't jump to conclusions, but the breadcrumbs were piling up. The turning point came the following Sunday. I decided to follow her. It felt ridiculous, like something out of a bad soap opera. But my gut wouldn't let it go. I left 5 minutes after she did, taking the car I usually reserved for weekends, a black sedan with tinted windows that blended in easily. I parked across the street from Joe's Brew and Roast, waiting. It wasn't long before I spotted her. Vanessa wasn't alone. She was sitting at a corner table with a guy. Average looking, maybe mid-30s, with messy brown hair and a faded denim jacket. They were laughing, leaning in close. He reached across the table at one point, brushing her hand, and she didn't pull away. My chest felt tight. Who the hell was this guy? I pulled out my phone and snapped a picture through the windshield. Vanessa looked radiant, her face lit up in a way I hadn't seen in years. And it wasn't me making her smile like that. Back home, I couldn't focus. Every time I tried to get back to work, the image of Vanessa with that guy burned into my brain. Who was he? How long had this been going on? Was this the reason she'd been so distant? That night, she came home later than usual. Good coffee? I asked as casually as I could. The best, she replied, her tone light. She didn't ask me about my day, didn't notice how distracted I was. And I didn't push. Not yet. But I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going to let this slide. By the next Sunday, I had a plan. Vanessa left at her usual time, wearing that same flirty smile she'd been flaunting for weeks now. I waited until her car turned the corner before grabbing my jacket. This time, I wasn't just going to watch. I parked in the same spot as last time, across from Joe's Brew and Roast. My heart pounded as I stepped out of the car. The small cafe was cozy, with a few tables scattered outside under striped umbrellas. From where I stood on the sidewalk, I had a clear view through the glass front. And there she was. Vanessa sat at the same corner table, her back partially turned to me. Across from her was him. The ordinary guy. He looked the same as before, scruffy hair, unshaven jaw, and that damn denim jacket. I pushed the door open, the bell overhead jingling softly. Vanessa didn't notice me at first. She was too engrossed in whatever he was saying. Her laugh rang out, light and carefree. It twisted something inside me. When I walked up to the counter, the barista greeted me with a friendly smile. Just a black coffee, I said, keeping my voice steady. As I waited, I shifted my gaze back to their table. This time, I caught her face in profile. She looked younger somehow, more alive. She reached out, brushing his hand, and my blood turned cold. The barista handed me my coffee, but I didn't move. Not yet. I wasn't sure what I'd planned to do, if I even wanted to confront her here. The guy leaned in closer, his voice low. Vanessa nodded, her eyes soft, like she was hanging on to his every word. I stepped back outside, the coffee untouched in my hand. When Vanessa came home that evening, I was sitting in the living room, pretending to read. She greeted me with a breezy, "Hey, babe," like nothing had happened. "Hey," I replied, glancing up from the book. "How was the coffee?" She paused for a fraction of a second. "Same as always. Pretty good. Do you ever try anything new there?" "No, not really," she said, slipping off her shoes. "Why?" "Just curious." She gave me a quick smile before disappearing into the kitchen. My hands clenched the book tighter. Over the next week, I couldn't stop replaying what I'd seen. My instinct screamed that there was more to this than just friendly conversation. I started noticing all the little things, how she smiled at her phone when she thought I wasn't looking, the way she always seemed distracted when we talked. I needed answers. That Friday, I called up a friend of mine, Eddie. We'd gone to college together, and he now worked in cybersecurity. If anyone could help me dig deeper, it was him. "Let me get this straight," Eddie said after I explained the situation. "You think your wife's cheating on you, and you want me to play detective?" "Pretty much." Eddie sighed. "You know this is a slippery slope, right? What if you find something you don't want to know?" "I already know," I said grimly. "I just need proof." He was quiet for a moment before agreeing. "All right, I'll see what I can do. Got her phone number and email?" I rattled them off, and he promised to get back to me soon. By Saturday, Eddie had sent me a list of phone records and text logs. Most of it was mundane, messages from friends, emails from her work. But one number stood out. "Who's 845-555-7321? I asked him over the phone. No idea, but she's been texting and calling it a lot, Eddie replied. You might want to cross-reference that with any other info you've got. I did a reverse lookup, but the number came back unlisted. Frustrated, I decided to play it cool and wait for Sunday. The next day, I followed Vanessa again. This time, I parked closer, ensuring I'd have a better vantage point. She met the same guy, but instead of sitting at the cafe, they walked out together after only a few minutes. I tailed them discreetly, keeping my distance. They strolled through the park, talking and laughing like they didn't have a care in the world. At one point, they stopped by a bench, and he reached out to tuck her hair behind her ear. I wanted to march over and confront them, but I forced myself to stay calm. I needed more. After about 20 minutes, they walked back to the parking lot. She got into her car, but he didn't. Instead, he headed toward an old, beat-up pickup truck parked a few spaces away. I took a picture of his license plate before following Vanessa home. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept staring at the photo of his plate, my thoughts spiraling. Who the hell was this guy? And how long had this been going on? I had enough to start digging deeper, but I knew one thing for sure: Vanessa wasn't just getting coffee. The following morning, I woke up with one goal: find out everything about this guy. After dropping the kids off at their activities, something Vanessa usually handled but was too tired for, I sat down at my desk and got to work. The photo of the truck's license plate was grainy, but it was clear enough to run a check. I called Eddie again. Need one more favor, I said. You're relentless, man, he replied with a laugh. What is it this time? I sent him the picture of the plate. Can you find out who this belongs to? You know I'm not supposed to do this, right? And yet here we are. He sighed. Fine. Give me a few hours. By mid-afternoon, Eddie called back. Got a name for you, he said. Kyle Davis. 34. Lives in a one-bedroom apartment a couple miles from that coffee shop. Anything else? He works part-time at the coffee shop. No priors, no flashy background. Just your run-of-the-mill barista/struggling artist type. You sure this is the guy? Oh, I'm sure. My grip tightened on the phone. Kyle Davis. A name to go with the face that had been haunting me for days. That night, Vanessa was quieter than usual. She sat on the couch scrolling through her phone while I pretended to watch TV. My mind was elsewhere, replaying everything I'd learned. Finally, I broke the silence. What's on your mind? She glanced up, startled. Huh? Oh, nothing. Just tired. Work stuff? Yeah, she said quickly, her voice a little too high-pitched. I nodded, keeping my expression neutral. The next Sunday, I couldn't resist. I followed her again, parking just far enough to remain inconspicuous. This time, after meeting Kyle at the cafe, she didn't linger for coffee or a walk in the park. Instead, they got into his truck and drove off together. My heart pounded as I tailed them, careful not to get too close. They headed out of town, taking winding back roads that eventually led to a small, secluded house nestled among the trees. They pulled into the driveway, and Vanessa got out, laughing at something Kyle said. He opened the door for her, and they disappeared inside. I sat in my car, stunned. This was more than just a fling. She wasn't sneaking around with some guy in parking lots or stealing moments at the coffee shop. She was spending time in his house. It felt like a slap in the face. I sat there for what felt like hours, debating my next move. Should I storm in and confront them? Should I call her right now and demand answers? Instead, I pulled out my phone and took a few pictures of her car parked in his driveway. Proof. That's what I needed. Proof to confront her, and to protect myself when this all came crashing down. When Vanessa came home that evening, she acted like nothing was wrong. How was your day? I asked, keeping my tone light. Good. Quiet, she replied, shrugging. Same as always. I forced a smile, hiding the storm of emotions brewing inside me. Glad to hear it. That night, I sent the pictures to Eddie. Think this is enough? I asked him. Enough for what? To prove she's been cheating, I said bluntly. Eddie hesitated. Look, man, I get that you're pissed, but do you really want to go scorched earth on this? Maybe you should talk to her first. I clenched my jaw. Talk to her? What do you think she's going to say? Sorry, honey, I've been sneaking off to my boyfriend's cabin? I need more than words. Eddie sighed. All right. But tread carefully, okay? Things can get messy fast. The next day, I started digging into divorce lawyers. It felt premature, but I needed to know my options. I wasn't going to let her blindside me. By midweek, I'd booked a consultation with one of the best family attorneys in town. When I explained the situation, she nodded sympathetically. Infidelity doesn't necessarily give you leverage in court, she explained, but it can help if you're trying to protect assets or establish custody arrangements. No kids, I said, my voice flat. Then it's mostly about division of property, she continued. Have you confronted her yet? Not yet, I admitted. I wanted to get my ducks in a row first. Smart, she said. But just know, the longer this drags on, the more complicated it can get. The sooner you address it, the better. That night, Vanessa asked me if I was working late. Why? I asked. I thought maybe we could have dinner together. Just the two of us, she said, her tone almost shy. Part of me wanted to believe her, to think this was her way of reaching out, of fixing whatever had gone wrong between us. But I couldn't shake the image of her walking into Kyle's house. Sure, I said, forcing a smile. As I watched her set the table, humming softly to herself, I couldn't help but wonder, was she feeling guilty? Or was this just another part of her act? Dinner that night was almost surreal. Vanessa had gone all out, lighting candles and setting out the good dishes. She even made her famous chicken marsala, something she hadn't cooked in months. So, what's the occasion? I asked as I sat down. No occasion, she said with a smile. Just thought we could use a nice dinner together. Her voice was light, her tone casual, but I could see the tension in her shoulders. She was trying too hard. We made small talk for a while, work, the weather, the usual surface-level stuff. But as the meal went on, I couldn't help myself. So, how's the coffee shop these days? I asked, keeping my voice as neutral as possible. Vanessa froze for the briefest moment, her fork halfway to her mouth. Good. Why? Just curious. You seem to go there a lot. She shrugged, her movements a little too forced. It's relaxing. I like the atmosphere. And the company? I pressed. Her eyes flicked up to meet mine, wide with surprise. What's that supposed to mean? I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms. You tell me. Vanessa set down her fork, her expression shifting from surprise to something more defensive. Mason, if you've got something to say, just say it. I could feel the anger bubbling up, but I forced myself to stay calm. Who's Kyle? Her face went pale. What? I said, who's Kyle? You know, the guy you've been spending your Sundays with. For a moment, she looked like a deer caught in headlights. Then her expression hardened. Have you been following me? That's what you're worried about. I shot back. Not the fact that you've been sneaking around behind my back? Vanessa stood up, pushing her chair back so hard it nearly tipped over. I can't believe you would spy on me like that. What the hell is wrong with you? What's wrong with me? I shouted, finally letting the anger spill out. What's wrong with you, Vanessa? Do you think I wouldn't notice? The sneaking out, the lies, the perfume, the goddamn lipstick you never wore before. Did you really think I was that stupid? Her eyes filled with tears, but I didn't let up. You've been going to his house, I continued. I saw you. I have pictures. Don't even try to deny it. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, finally, she sat back down, her shoulders slumping in defeat. It's not what you think, she said softly. Oh, really? I shot back. So what is it, Vanessa? You're just friends? Because I don't remember the last time you laughed like that with me. She buried her face in her hands, her voice muffled. I didn't mean for it to happen. Those words hit me like a punch to the gut. For the next hour, Vanessa spilled everything. She'd met Kyle at the coffee shop months ago. At first, it was innocent, just casual conversations while he made her latte. But over time, those conversations grew longer, more personal. I felt seen, she admitted, her voice shaking. You're always so busy, Mason. And I get it, I do. You work hard for us. But I felt invisible. Like I wasn't a priority anymore. So your solution was to cheat? I said bitterly. I didn't plan it, she said, her eyes red. It just happened. That's not an excuse, I snapped. You had a choice, Vanessa. And you chose him. She didn't argue. She just sat there, crying silently, as the weight of her confession settled between us. That night, I slept in the guest room. Or rather, I didn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling for hours, my mind racing. Was this the end? Could we even come back from this? By morning, I had my answer. When Vanessa came downstairs, her eyes were puffy, and she looked like she hadn't slept either. We need to talk, I said, my voice cold. She nodded, sitting down across from me at the kitchen table. I'm not going to drag this out, I began. I've already spoken to a lawyer. Her eyes widened in panic. Mason, no. Please. It was a mistake. I swear, it didn't mean anything. Don't, I interrupted. Don't insult me by pretending it didn't mean anything. You don't drive to someone's house in the middle of nowhere for something that doesn't mean anything. She opened her mouth to protest, but I held up a hand. I'm not interested in your excuses, I said firmly. This is over, Vanessa. I'll have the papers drawn up by the end of the week. Tears streamed down her face, but I felt nothing. Whatever love I'd had for her was buried under a mountain of betrayal. The next few days passed in a blur of cold detachment. I threw myself into work, using it as a shield to avoid dealing with the mess my life had become. Vanessa tried to talk to me a few times, but I shut her down each time. There's nothing left to say, I told her. You made your choice, Vanessa. Now you have to live with it. On Wednesday, I met with my lawyer to finalize the divorce papers. We'll keep things straightforward, she said. You don't have kids, which simplifies the process. We'll protect your assets and ensure a fair division of property. I nodded, barely listening. My mind was elsewhere, replaying every moment of the past few weeks like a broken record. That night, Vanessa cornered me in the kitchen. Mason, please, she said, her voice breaking. I know I screwed up, but we can fix this. We've been through so much together. Don't throw it all away. Her words should have moved me, but they didn't. I felt hollow, like something inside me had already shut down. I didn't throw anything away, I replied evenly. You did. She reached for my hand, but I pulled away. I can't do this, Vanessa. Not anymore. The day I handed her the divorce papers was the day reality seemed to hit her. She stared at the document for a long time, her hands trembling. So that's it, she whispered. You're really done? What did you expect? I shot back. That I'd just forgive you and we'd go back to how things were? I thought you'd fight for us, she said, tears streaming down her face. Fight for what? I said, my voice rising. For someone who didn't fight for me? For someone who ran to another man the second things got hard? She had no response. As the days turned into weeks, I started to rebuild my life. Moving out of the house was the first step. I rented a penthouse apartment downtown, a stark contrast to the suburban home Vanessa and I had shared. It felt strange at first, lonely, but also liberating. I dove headfirst into work, expanding my business and taking on new projects. Success was my revenge, and I was determined to thrive without her. Vanessa, on the other hand, didn't handle the fallout well. I'd heard from mutual friends that she was struggling. She'd moved in with a friend, leaving behind the life we'd built together. Part of me felt a twinge of pity for her, but I quickly pushed it aside. She'd made her bed. Now she had to lie in it. One night, months after the papers were signed, I ran into Kyle at a local bar. He was sitting at a corner table, nursing a beer and looking worse for wear. "Fancy seeing you here," I said, sliding into the seat across from him. He looked up, startled. "Mason." There was no warmth in his voice, only unease. "How's life treating you, Kyle?" I asked, my tone dripping with sarcasm. He shifted uncomfortably. "Look, man, I didn't mean for any of this to happen." "Save it," I interrupted. "I don't care about your excuses. You're nothing to me. Just a footnote in a story I'm already putting behind me." Kyle nodded, looking relieved when I finally stood to leave. As I walked out of the bar, I felt a strange sense of closure. It wasn't forgiveness, not by a long shot. But it was enough to know I'd moved on while he was still stuck in the mess he'd helped create. Vanessa tried to reach out a few times after the divorce was finalized, leaving voicemails and emails I never answered. She sent a letter once, begging for a second chance, but I tore it up without reading past the first sentence. I wasn't the same man I'd been before all this. I was harder, sharper, and more focused than ever. Months turned into a year, and I found myself finally feeling at peace. Life wasn't perfect, but it was mine again. I'd learned the hard way that trust, once broken, could never truly be repaired. And as for Vanessa? She was just a chapter in my story, one I'd closed for good. A year after the divorce, I finally let myself reflect on what had happened, not just the betrayal, but the years leading up to it. In hindsight, there were cracks in our marriage long before Kyle came into the picture. Vanessa had always been more emotionally driven, while I was laser-focused on my goals. At first, we balanced each other out. She brought warmth and spontaneity to my structured world, and I gave her the stability she craved. But somewhere along the way, I got lost in the grind. Building my business became my everything, and I didn't notice how far apart we'd grown until it was too late. That realization didn't absolve her of what she did. Cheating was a choice, not a mistake. But it did make me wonder if things could have been different, if I'd paid more attention, been more present. Around that time, I started seeing a therapist. It wasn't something I ever thought I'd do, but I needed to unpack the weight I was carrying. "You've been through a significant loss," the therapist said during one of our early sessions. "Even though the marriage ended on bad terms, it's natural to grieve what you thought you had." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. She was right. The grief wasn't just about Vanessa. It was about the life I thought we were building together. "It's also important to acknowledge what you've gained," she continued. "You've taken steps to reclaim your independence and create a life that's fulfilling on your own terms." Those words stuck with me. Slowly but surely, I began to rebuild, not just my external life but my internal one as well. I reconnected with old friends, picked up hobbies I'd abandoned, and even started dating again. It wasn't easy. Trusting someone new felt impossible at first. But I reminded myself that not everyone was Vanessa. About 2 years after the divorce, I ran into one of our mutual friends at a networking event. "Have you heard about Vanessa?" she asked, her tone cautious. "No," I said, bracing myself. "What about her?" "She moved back to her hometown," the friend said. "Apparently, things didn't work out with that guy she was seeing. Kyle, right?" I felt a flicker of vindication but kept my expression neutral. "I'm not surprised. She's been asking about you," the friend added, lowering her voice. "Said she regrets everything?" I shrugged. "That's her burden to carry, not mine." The friend nodded, as if she expected that response. As time went on, Vanessa became less and less of a presence in my life. She was a ghost, a memory I'd made peace with and let go. And as for me? I was thriving. My business had grown beyond what I'd ever imagined, and I'd started traveling more, taking the time to enjoy the fruits of my labor. Life wasn't perfect, but it was mine. One day, while sitting on the balcony of my penthouse, overlooking the city skyline, I thought about everything that had led me here. The betrayal, the heartbreak, the loss, it had all shaped me in ways I never could have anticipated. And for the first time in years, I felt truly free. Freedom was a strange thing. For years I thought it meant control over my time, my money, my life. But sitting there on that balcony, I realized freedom was something quieter. It wasn't about controlling everything. It was about letting go. Vanessa was gone, and so was the weight of our broken marriage. My business was thriving, my friendships were solid, and for the first time, I was learning how to enjoy life for myself. But just when I thought I'd put it all behind me, life threw one last curveball. It happened on an unassuming Tuesday afternoon. I was at a downtown cafe, reviewing some documents for a potential partnership. The place was bustling, but I'd found a quiet corner near the back. "Excuse me, Mason?" I looked up, startled by the familiar voice. It was Vanessa. She stood there, looking both hesitant and hopeful. Her hair was shorter than I remembered, and she seemed more subdued, almost fragile. "What are you doing here?" I asked, my tone carefully neutral. "I moved back a few weeks ago," she said, shifting awkwardly. "I didn't know you came here." "I don't usually," I replied, closing my laptop. "What do you want, Vanessa?" She hesitated, then sat down across from me without waiting for an invitation. "I've been thinking about you," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "About us." I leaned back in my chair, folding my arms. "You mean the version of us you blew up?" She winced, but I didn't feel any satisfaction in her pain. "I deserve that," she admitted. "I deserve all of it. I wanted to say I'm sorry." I raised an eyebrow. "For what? For lying? For cheating? Or for pretending to care while you were sneaking off with someone else?" Vanessa looked down at her hands. "For all of it. I was selfish, and I hurt you in ways I can't take back. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I needed to tell you." Her words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken regret. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to lash out, to throw her apology back in her face. But another part of me, the part that had spent the past 2 years rebuilding, felt something closer to pity. "I don't hate you, Vanessa," I said finally. "But I don't forgive you either. Not because I can't, but because it doesn't matter anymore." Her eyes filled with tears, and she nodded. "I understand. I've moved on," I continued, my voice steady. "And you should, too. Whatever you're looking for from me, you're not going to find it here." Vanessa wiped her eyes and stood up. "Thank you for hearing me out," she said softly. I nodded, watching as she walked away. That night, I thought about our conversation. Her apology didn't change anything, it couldn't. But it did give me a sense of closure I didn't realize I needed. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't bitter. I was just done. Over the next few months, life continued to improve. I expanded my business into new markets, made new friends, and even started a relationship with someone who reminded me what it felt like to be truly seen. Vanessa became a distant memory, a chapter in my story that I'd finally closed for good. And as I stood on my balcony one evening, watching the city lights flicker below, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. Months passed, and with each day, the remnants of my life with Vanessa felt further away. Seeing her at the cafe had been a strange, unexpected moment, but it cemented something in me. I wasn't just surviving, I was thriving. My business was on track to hit record-breaking profits, thanks to a major partnership I'd secured with a global logistics firm. My days were full, but they were also mine. I made time for things I'd once brushed aside: weekend trips, golf outings with old friends, even an art class I'd signed up for on a whim. The relationship I'd started with Julia, a woman I'd met at a charity gala, was easy and light. Julia wasn't demanding or dramatic. She was a breath of fresh air, the kind of person who made me laugh without trying too hard. "Do you ever slow down?" she teased one evening over dinner at her place. "I'm trying," I said with a grin, raising my glass of wine. "To trying," she said, clinking her glass against mine. But even as things improved, there were moments when I couldn't help but look back. Not with longing, but with curiosity. What would have happened if Vanessa and I had been honest with each other sooner? Could we have saved what we'd built? One night, after a particularly long day at work, I found myself scrolling through old photos. There we were, Vanessa and me, smiling at a beach resort, laughing at some forgotten joke during a holiday dinner, holding hands at a friend's wedding. It didn't hurt anymore to look at those pictures, but it felt strange. Like looking at someone else's life. A few weeks later, Julia invited me to a dinner party at her friend's house. The evening was lively, with good food, great wine, and even better company. As the night wound down, Julia pulled me aside. "You're quiet tonight," she said, her tone gentle. "Just thinking," I admitted. "About her?" I hesitated, then nodded. "A little. It's not what you think. I don't miss her, I haven't in a long time. But I wonder if I could have done things differently." Julia smiled softly. "You're human, Mason. It's okay to wonder. But don't let the past steal your present." Her words hit me harder than I expected. She was right, of course. "I'm here," I said, squeezing her hand. "With you. That's what matters." As the months turned into another year, I let go of the last lingering threads of regret. Vanessa had reached out a couple more times, an email here, a text there, but I didn't respond. Not out of spite, but because I had nothing left to say. My relationship with Julia deepened, and for the first time in years, I felt like I could see a future with someone. We traveled together, exploring hidden beaches and bustling cities. She challenged me in ways Vanessa never had, pushing me to slow down, to be present. "You're not your work, Mason," she said one evening as we sat by the fire pit on her patio. "You're so much more than that." I looked at her, the flames casting a warm glow on her face. For the first time, I believed her. One day, while cleaning out my old storage unit, I stumbled across a box labeled MV. It was filled with mementos from my marriage, concert tickets, anniversary cards, little trinkets we picked up on our travels. I sat down on the concrete floor, the open box in front of me. For a moment, I considered throwing it all away. But instead, I closed the lid and set the box aside. It wasn't about holding on to the past, it was about honoring it. That part of my life was over, but it had shaped me into the man I was today. On a crisp autumn morning, Julia and I walked hand in hand through the park. The leaves were a riot of colors, crunching under our feet as we strolled. "What's next for us?" she asked, her voice playful. "Whatever we want," I said, smiling. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I meant it.